Joshua, and now we're in the period of the Judges, and we'll start with Ruth, chapter 1, verse 1, and I'm just going to read it right out of the story, this first part this morning. The faith of a foreign woman, chapter 9, it's on page 121. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah, the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of the people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness, as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. And even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It is better for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." That's how she felt. You can imagine losing her husband and then losing her 2 sons. She felt like the Lord had just turned against her. And sometimes that's how you and I feel when things are going badly for us, when our circumstances are very difficult. And as they wept aloud again, then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. I'll stop there with the reading of God's holy word. Well, in a couple weeks we're going to celebrate Thanksgiving, and Thanksgiving really took place when the first pilgrims went through a brutal, terrible winter, and then survived. Those that survived gave thanks to God for the blessings they received. And, this is the early 1600s of the pilgrims, when the pilgrims came. We are a nation of immigrants. We are a nation of people who came mostly from Europe, now from all over the world. What do refugees and immigrants have to do with the book of Ruth? Well, I think we'll see that in this story where Ruth is friendless but still friendly, through no fault of her own, Ruth found herself a widow and a poor stranger in a foreign land. And her only friend really was her mother-in-law, Naomi. The story of Ruth begins with a famine in Israel that causes a Jewish man named Elimelech to move to Moab. Now, Moab was they were considered kind of an enemy country. They were always at odds with the people of God. But he went there because he was desperate. There was a famine in the land. And oftentimes, whether it's because of religious persecution or whether it's because of economic hardship or whether it's because of just survival because of war, as we see today. Many times people move to another country in order to survive and get along. Well, we see that while they were in that land, Naomi loses her husband to death and then lived there with her sons, and they both marry Moabite women, and later on, both of her sons die. And you can imagine how she felt. God is against me. His hand is against me. And we can only imagine the grief that was taking place in her heart and life as she lost her husband and 2 sons. And so she's going to be moving back now because she heard that that God had blessed the land with food and the famine was over. And she felt compelled to go back to her hometown of Bethlehem to live again. And she tells her daughters-in-laws to go back home because she knew that they would not be welcomed with open arms back in Bethlehem among the Jewish people. She knew how people looked at Moabites. And she tells them to go back and live with their own families again. One of them goes back. Oprah goes back. Ruth does not go back. She refuses to go back. You know, when I thought about this situation, I couldn't help but think of the refugees that are leaving Syria and Afghanistan right now and pouring into Europe today. I was talking to my daughter and son-in-law the other day who are taking teams to the Croatian-Serbian border to help refugees, and how just that last weekend when I was talking to them, 8,000 had crossed the border. And they mentioned that they estimate that about 1 million refugees have now entered Germany, who has opened their arms to them. And so we see people are leaving because they're in a desperate situation. Desperate things cause people to leave their loved ones, leave their culture, leave their language group, and go just to survive. Well, now Ruth becomes an immigrant in a foreign land. And she goes, along with her mother-in-law. But I'm also reminded that God watches over people who are in desperate situations. God cares about our pain. He cares about our loss. He cares about being near to those who are experiencing problems. In Psalm 34:19, David said this, "A righteous man may have many troubles, but the Lord delivers him from them all." Now, it's easy to just skip to, the Lord delivers us, and I've done that many times. But when you're in the many troubles, and it says, a righteous man, we think, oh, well, if I just live a good life, if I just live a righteous life, I won't have any troubles, right? Isn't that what we like to think many times? Or some people portray to us? Well, that's not true. Sadly, I cannot say to you The Bible says if you live a righteous life, you won't have any troubles in this life. No. Godly, righteous people have troubles in this fallen, sinful world. We are not exempt. Many godly people have died early from diseases. Many godly people have died early due to accidents, other things. But he says God delivers them. Now sometimes, granted, that deliverance, we don't see it in this life. And we can say, well, that's a real cop-out. God's going to deliver us, but not in this life. You know what? If there wasn't an eternity, if there wasn't a heaven, and if it wasn't so glorious, that would be true. But in our finite minds, we can only imagine the good things of this world. Isn't that true? So often, that's all we can really imagine. If we just had a bigger house, if we just had more money, if we just had this, and that, then, wow. I'll tell you, people that have all of that are committing suicide. It doesn't make people happy. There will be no heaven on earth, regardless of how wealthy and successful you appear before man. The truth is, there is a heaven, and there is going to be a restored Eden. We talked about that first Eden. Remember when we started out in Genesis, that perfect place where Adam and Eve walked in the garden with God. And there was this relationship where they could just talk and live in harmony with God. Well, that Eden is going to be restored. And that's what heaven is about. But it's not going to take place now. That's what we look forward to. In the meantime, there is troubles. And it's a long journey. And there's denial and anger and bargaining and depression many times that takes place when there's loss, like losing a husband and 2 sons. But Naomi decides to go back home and tells the Moabites gals, her daughter-in-laws, to go back to their hometown. But Ruth surprises her mother-in-law with these beautiful words. And we read them in Ruth chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. This is what she says to her mother-in-law. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people. Your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me. Wow. Your God be my God. This is a woman of faith. This is a woman who has come to faith through, very possibly, through her in-laws and through the witness of her husband. That's a beautiful thing. And Naomi could see that she was sincere. And so they left for Bethlehem, where Ruth would live as a stranger among a people who looked down on anybody who was from Moab, any Moabite. And I don't know if you've ever experienced being a lone foreigner in another country who doesn't fit in, but I can only imagine it must be very trying and difficult. That must have been how Ruth felt. She must have had no friends and no real prospects of friends. And she looked different. She had this foreign accent. And if that wasn't bad enough, she was dirt poor. 2 widows in that culture with no Social Security, no food stamps, no government help programs. But Ruth was not one to just sit back and feel sorry for herself. She followed the procedure used by other families who were desperately poor. She went out and picked loose grain in the fields. It was called gleaning. And according to the law of Moses, in Deuteronomy 24, that's exactly what God wanted to take place when there were people in need. He says in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 19, when you are harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheaf, do not go back to get it. Leave it for the alien, the fatherless, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. He's saying to those people in that agricultural society, you want to be blessed? Then make sure that you leave some things for the poor, that you leave behind grain, you leave behind crops on purpose for those who are in need. And so now, as it turned out, the owner of one of those fields where Ruth goes to glean, we know was a prosperous Jewish man named Boaz. And he looked with favor and kindly towards Ruth. Now, Ruth's reaction tells us that she wasn't used to this kind of treatment. I mean, this was unusual in that situation where she was a Moabite. At this, Ruth bowed down with her face to the ground, and she exclaimed, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes, that you notice me, a foreigner?" Chapter 2, verse 10. See, it sounds like Ruth was used to being ignored at best, or even worse, shown prejudice. And it was probably at times worse because Naomi makes a statement that later shows Ruth was actually in physical danger. In Ruth chapter 2, verse 22, Naomi says, "It would be good for you, my daughter, to go to the field of Boaz, because in someone else's field you may be harmed." Why? Because you're a Moabite. People don't like Moabites around here. Have you ever been the victim in that regard because of racism or someone looking down on you? I really believe that some people have, probably some people right here. You've had that hurt, someone calling you a name, someone saying things. I remember when I was in California, at our church, there were a lot of dairy people, and one Dutch lady said to me, she said, "You know, I know what it's like to have prejudice, experience prejudice." She says, "When I came here as an immigrant, I went to grade school, and I couldn't even speak a word of English. And what English I could speak, I had this Dutch brogue. And she said the kids would laugh at me, and they'd make fun of me in school. And I'd come home crying to my mom because kids were making fun of me. And she would just tell me that I had to go back and trust God to give me strength. And she said, God did. Well, you know, we have a faithful God, a God that watches over those who are desperate. And even today we see racism going on in our society and prejudice. And Ruth, I believe, had this faith in God that enabled her to overcome prejudice. Because ultimately, all of us need to get our self-worth from God. If we're going to depend on other people, or we're going to depend on someone or some success to give us our self-worth, we're always going to struggle. Because there's always going to be a teacher or a coach or someone who's going to demean us. And if our self-worth depends on what other people say about us or do to us. It's just a matter of time when we're going to be devastated and frustrated. So we need to recognize that we're a creation of God. We're created with gifts and with talents and abilities, and every person, regardless of the color of your skin or regardless of what your ability is, you have worth before God because you're created in the image of God. And that means you're able to love, you're able to reason, you're able to love God and love others because God's given this to you, and He's given you gifts to fulfill your purpose here on earth. Well, God's grace was shown through Boaz. If we look at chapter 3 of Ruth, chapter 3, beginning with verse 1. One day, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, should I not try to find a home for you where you will be well provided for?" You know, doesn't every mother or mother-in-law have a little matchmaking in their system? You know, they want to kind of, you know, get somebody for their daughter or whatever. And this is what's happening here. Is not Boaz, with whose servant girls you have been a kinsman of ours? Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash and perfume yourself and put on your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do.